Welcome, everyone. My name is Sean Farina. I've spent the better part of a decade working in television, mostly as a writer's assistant. And what that is the person who sits in the room and takes notes while all of the writers are throwing ideas around and helping craft story for whatever episode we are on at the moment. I already have a question. Oh, hey, I'm excited to be here. Thanks. So I have been in the room for watching dozens of episodes of TV come together. I had a front row seat for that and was actively participating in that in various aspects. And I wound up writing an episode of Hawaii Five-0 while I was working on that show. So I've seen, a whole lot of television coming together. All the shows that I've worked on were network dramas, so that's kind of where my knowledge is most focused, but I've got friends who've worked on comedies. Some of the writers who have worked on the shows that I've been on had worked on comedies, so I'll try to get in a little bit about how working in the comedy world is a little bit different. But let's get started here. So, that's a little title. And let's start with the writer's room. The writer's room is what it sounds like. It's where all the writers congregate to work on whatever episode is being written at the moment. Most shows have a writer's room. There are a few that don't, where writers will just work on breaking their own episodes and then talk to the showrunner about it. And the showrunner will have a bigger hand in kind of making sure that each writer is individually working on the serialized elements of the show. Supernatural was like that. Most shows that aren't going to have a writer's room are going to be procedurals because those are your Law and Orders, your Bones episodes or shows like that, because they're more self-contained week to week. Although increasingly we're seeing procedurals having more and more serialized elements. So writers' rooms are ranked by experience. So there are a number of rankings. When you first start at the lowest level, you're a staff writer. Then you've got the story editor, executive story editor, co-producer, producer, supervising producer, co-executive producer, and executive producer. And some of those titles will go to other people who are involved in the show doing different things, but that's how the writers are ranked from bottom to top. You'll get a consulting producer every once in a while also, and that'll be somebody who is actually a consultant because they have some sort of expertise in whatever the show is about. If you have a retired cop who's advising on a procedural, might be a consulting producer if they're not a writer. Or they might start writing sometimes also as well. I knew someone on Hawaii Five-0 who started out advising on CSI New York because he was a retired cop and eventually started writing episodes there and then is now having a second career as a writer. John Dove, very, very great guy. Let's see. So when you're in the writer's room, obviously somebody has to be kind of corralling all the ideas that are being thrown around and kind of help make decisions about that are going to help focus the story toward what it's going to finally wind up being. I'm calling that person the lieutenant if the showrunner is not in the room doing that. Most often, because the showrunner has a lot of responsibilities outside of running the writer's room, including overseeing production and, dealing with, actors, script changes, meetings with, phone meetings with executives. Showrunner is a huge job. You are the boss of everybody in the writer's room and production, everything. So, when the showrunner is not in the room, they will often leave somebody else in charge to, as I said, kind of corral all the ideas so that when the showrunner comes back into the room, they have something solid to pitch the showrunner. This, process will be a little bit different from show to show. Sometimes there'll be a couple of lieutenants. Again, that's just the term that I'm using. The term that I also use sometimes is the Goodman, because on Once Upon a Time, the show that I worked on, David H. Goodman was the lieutenant, and was very, very good at that. It's a tough job. You're kind of, sometimes they'll be called co-showrunners, but whoever is the official showrunner is the one who's responsible for making the final call for all material, as you can see there. So in the writer's room, we always have, as you can see in the background there with those note cards, oh, excuse me, let me take a step back here. All right, so there's a couple of showrunners you may recognize, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss from Game of Thrones. However you felt about that finale, they still got piles of money for it. So when the next episode of a show is coming up, it's going to work differently whether it is a serialized show or a procedural. And I'm speaking mostly in generalities here because there will be exceptions from time to time in how this process goes. But on a serialized show, that's, the ones that most of the ones I've worked on were serialized, Lost and Once Upon a Time. And, we know how, at the end of every episode, there's a big cliffhanger. You want to come back to next week. It's the, model that primetime TV took from daytime soap operas. And, there are at least as many serialized shows now as there are procedurals. So, once, say episode 6 is written, or episode 6 is out of the room, which is to say that the writing staff has done their job breaking the episode, and the writer who's going to be writing that episode, or writers, are off writing an outline. We're going to get more into that process in a minute. It's time for episode 7. So the showrunners will say, okay, so we want episode 7 to, kind of take this character from here to here. They'll lay out some parameters for where they want the plot and for where they want the characters to be, to give some focus to the writers who are going to start, working on helping shape the episode. And there's a reason that writers are credited as producers. One is because they're generally involved in production, which I'm going to get into more later, but also because every episode of TV that has a room, like I discussed, I've been describing the process where everybody is contributing to the story. So everyone, you'll have the lieutenant leading the room or the writer of the episode, and, they'll be up writing on the board as everyone is throwing around ideas, but everyone is contributing ideas to making the show the best that it can be. So everyone will start working on whatever the next episode of the serialized show is. In procedurals, that'll often that can start the same way. Ideas can come from the showrunner. There are rooms in procedurals as well, but oftentimes, because procedurals are much more self-contained, the ideas will come from a writer who pitches their idea. The episode of Hawaii Five-0 that I got to write when I was still an assistant, I got to write it because I had an idea. I pitched it to the showrunner. I didn't pitch it immediately to the showrunner. I pitched it to some of the higher level writers who weren't quite the showrunner. And they gave me some feedback. Then I got to pitch it to the showrunner. He said, I like this idea, let's do it. And I'd say probably on Hawaii Five-0, I can't speak to too many other procedurals, but at least half of the episodes per season came from writers who pitched them. And the other half was, showrunner was like, let's do an episode with this. You guys figure it out. Again, these are generalizations for how each of these work. Certainly, if at the beginning of a serialized show, there is a an order given to work with a certain plot point or character, and then a writer says, wouldn't it be better if we do this? Then, you know, you could change course if the showrunner agrees. But at the end of the day, like I said, the showrunners are the ones who dictate everything until the network tells them no. We'll get into that more later, too. Adaptations can be a little different, though. You're looking at the showrunners for Game of Thrones. When I was on Once Upon a Time, Jane Espenson was in that room. She wrote an episode of Game of Thrones in the first season, and she told us that when her assignment was basically, they gave her a copy of the book and said, adapt from this page to this page. That's not how every adaptation works, but that's how it works on that show. So that's a way that the next episode of a show could come about a little bit differently. Breaking the story. So that's what the process that I was describing with all the writers working together to shape the story. As this process is happening, the episode is called being on the board. And like I said, every writer is working together to bring the story together. And then when the episode is being broken, and breaking the story means just, shaping it, putting it up on the board. I don't know why it's called breaking the story, but that's what it's called. Every room has a board. Your two basic white boards are the whiteboard and a cork board with note cards. So every room that I've been in has had whiteboards. And you can see here that on the board there is laid out act by act and scene by scene. The acts are each segment of the show in between the commercial breaks. You can see there's 3 different colors here on the board, and those will be for the different stories that run through the episode, often referred to as the A, B, and C stories. The A story is going to be the main focus of the episode. The B story can often be as big as the A story, but usually not. And the C story is usually, some kind of runner, as it'll be called, which would be, maybe 1 beat per episode. Maybe 1 beat per act that, isn't, would be about a more minor character or, minor plot point that isn't as important to moving the show forward. This is kind of a good visual representation of the work that all of the writers are putting into creating each episode. At the beginning of the credits of any TV show, you'll see that the show is written by, 1, 2, 3 people. And then, all the other writers are listed as producers, staff writers, whatever their rank is. So once the story is broken, which is to say it is up on the board, act by act, scene by scene, and all of that has been approved and signed off on by the showrunner, that is when the credited writers of the episode go off and we'll start with an outline and then a script. And we'll get into how that process works later. So here's an example of the whiteboard. Here are the note cards, again, laid out act by act, scene by scene. This is just a general preference thing for, how the showrunner wants the board to go. A lot of times, well, pretty much every writer also will have a whiteboard in their office that they will work on, or note cards. Again, just a matter of preference for that person. Every once in a while, though, you'll see a different board structure. Here's how Rick and Morty's boards look. You can see this is a 4-act structure, but they have it in a circle, which is just how they've chosen to represent the way that their stories go. And again, just a preference thing. Dan Harmon, as many of us may know, has a very unique mind, and this is the way stories make sense to him, and so that's just how they're going to look and how the room is going to follow along with them. And just for fun, here is this Seth Meyers show's weekly board for what different segments they're going to put in their show, which is a late night talk show, completely different, but around the room, in addition to the board for whatever particular episode is being broken at that moment, there'll also be other boards tracking, season-long arcs for characters. There'll be a list of the episodes that have aired already or are going to air. Ways to, make sure everybody is keeping, certain things in mind, especially with some of those serialized shows that get really complicated. When I was on Once Upon a Time, there was a board that was not even in the writer's room because it was so big it couldn't fit, but because of the flashback structure of the show, had a list of every character and everything that they did over a timeline, because all the flashbacks are out of order, and it is really tough to remember not just what happened, but whether something that was in a script actually made it to air. So it's really important to track all that. That's something else that writers' assistants and script coordinators are responsible for, because writers have a lot going on in their heads. And like I said, half the time, things that they pitch don't make it to script, don't make it to outline, don't make it to air. So they, wind up wondering, did that actually happen? Is that part of continuity, or is it just an idea we had? So very important. The small room. So this will happen more often on procedurals, where you'll have the main room, as I have described it, and then there will also be another smaller room where either a second story will be actively broken by another group of writers who have broken off for efficiency's sake, to keep things moving forward more smoothly. That'll be more often in the case of a procedural, or to work on revisions for an episode that has gotten feedback from the studio and network. There'll be times that the room will be working on episode 7, and then the showrunner will come in and say, okay, we just got notes back on the outline for episode 5. We need, you and you come help us address this, or you and you go to your offices and address that. That'll be what's called the small room. And then there's the fun of product integrations, which is pretty much product placement, but integration is the corporate buzzword for that. When I was on Alcatraz, there was a product integration agreement with, I believe it was Chevy. Oh no, Ford. It was Ford. And we had to, for a certain number of episodes, find a product integration that you hope to do as organically as possible, to showcase whatever features of that Ford wanted. And this is it's a good thing when the deal is made right, because usually the money for that will go straight into production and create opportunities to make the show better, despite having to hopefully artistically enough be serving another master, which is whoever the integration or partnership is with. On Hawaii Five-0, there were a number of product integrations. Most of them were able to be more organically executed because it was with various hotels that were on the island. So the Royal Hawaiian, they'd have to put a scene in the, whatever the King Kamehameha suite was, which, is easier to do than have to work in the Microsoft integration, which wound up, having our characters spend a lot of time kind of, waving around Microsoft tablets. All right, so pitching the studio and network. Oop, not sure what happened there. Anyway, so usually while the story is being broken still, the studio and network has to sign off on it. The studio is the entity that produces the show, The network is the channel that it airs on. So oftentimes those will be the same thing. For Lost and Once Upon a Time, ABC Studios produced the show and ABC Network aired it. They're still two different entities because not every show that airs on ABC is produced by ABC Studios. Not everything that ABC Studios produces airs on ABC Network. Alcatraz was produced by Warner Brothers and aired on Fox. CBS was, Hawaii Five-0 was Paramount Television and CBS. So you're, depending on how the studio network like to structure their notes, there could be either one notes call or two note calls to pitch the story and then get feedback on the various stages, which I still have yet to get into. And there are different ways that the story will be pitched to the studio and network. One is the story document, which will vary from show to show. On Alcatraz, the story document was the outline of the teaser and then a description of the rest of the episode, which totaled about 4 pages total. On Hawaii Five-0, it was a kind of brief description of the teaser and then separated out A story, B story, C story for the rest of the episode. And that's just to give the network an idea of, what they can expect this episode in terms of story, in terms of production difficulties, just everything they need to know. There could be a phone pitch too, which See, Once Upon a Time started out doing story documents, and then they just wound up doing phone pitches, where the showrunner would just pitch the episode to the network and the studio and network. Everybody was on that call. And then whoever the writers for that episode would be there, and they might, toss in a detail or two. And then the studio network would give feedback and say, oh, we like this, we don't like that, make sure that this is executed a certain way. We have concerns about, this story or this actor. We'll also talk about whether or not the director can handle that particular episode, or how they feel about the actors working with a certain director or things like that. Most episodes of TV are directed by people who don't work for the show. So that can be another thing that there will be feedback on when pitching the studio and network. So addressing notes coming off of that, generally the showrunners will walk right back into the room and say, okay, so the network liked this, they didn't like this, and, that'll kind of help shape how the episode will be broken moving forward. But every once in a while, there's the blow up. And that'll be when the network blows up the episode, which is to say, they just say, nope, we're not doing that. Most often, that'll be just disagreeing with the direction the show should be taking. They'll say that, like, oh, well, and often it'll be because of the audience, and just a general disagreement with what the audience wants from a character, from a plot line, especially on shows like Once and Lost, that are very character specific. They might say, we've had enough of this character already for this season. Let's spend some time with somebody else. There could be budget reasons too, where the showrunners will pitch some, huge, amazing battle sequence that is going to be, one of the highlights of the season. And the network will say, no, we're going to want to save the money that we would spend on that for later in the season or for something else. Actor availability is another thing that can blow up an episode. If a recurring character is supposed to be a part of a storyline, then they might not be available for that episode, depending on how their deal with the show is structured. So And then there could also be cultural or political factors. There was a time that there could be a story pitched for a procedural that involves a certain type of crime that maybe the network feels like it might be a little sensitive to be talking about that right now, so we don't want to do an episode on that. The outline and the script. So once the episode is broken and it has been pitched to the showrunner, and the showrunner signs off on it, and the network and studio have approved it. One more thing about the network and studio. So when you're working on a first-year show, and I did once on Alcatraz, the notes process will be much more intense. That's when you're much more likely to have many more drafts of the script and outline that have to go through first pitching the episode with the story document. Also, first with the studio, then with the network. And in some cases, as it was with Alcatraz, because it was a bad robot show, J.J. Abrams' company has, a lot of power. And they're basically a production company, but they developed the show. They had a production deal with Warner Brothers, who produces the show, and then Fox aired it. So because it was a first-year show and everybody, really, really wants the show to come back, everyone is very concerned about making sure that it's as good as it can be, there were actually 3 rounds of notes on everything. There was the Bad Robot round, there was the studio round, and the network round. So here's what that looks like. There's the same process for outlines and for script. So episode is off the board, which is what they call it when it's done being in the room, and the room is moving on to the next episode. The writer or writers of the episode will go off and write the outline, and then give it to the showrunner for notes. They'll do some revisions based on what the showrunner wants. It'll go around to the office for notes before it is given to the script coordinator to put together the studio and network draft. The studio network draft is just what it sounds like. It goes to the studio and the network, and then they give notes on, any aspect of it they see fit. They could, and at this stage too, they could decide to blow up, normally once it's gotten past the initial story pitch phase, there isn't going to be a blow up, but they could decide, well, the storyline didn't come together the way we thought it would, or we thought this would be bigger or smaller, or this character would have more or less to do. Or they'll have production concerns. It could be any number of things that studio network will give notes on. So that's the studio network draft that they give notes on. That'll come back, and the writers of the episode will address those notes. And then once that is done, that turns in, production will weigh in and say, well, this is going to be our budget isn't quite going to be able to handle what you want to do, or, we could get this actor, but we're not going to be able to afford them. Just all the practical issues of actually putting the episode together are discussed there. And then the production draft comes out. And that's when we get to start dealing with legal clearances. Most of this is pretty routine, episode by episode. The first thing is dealing with names. The rule for names is that, if it's taking place in America, either 0 people or more than 3 people in America can have that name. If there are 2 Wally Jenkinsons in America, sorry, you don't get to name a character Wally Jenkinson. That's pretty basic. Same thing with businesses. When you're coming up with names for businesses that are appearing in an episode, you got to make sure that nobody is going to come out of the woodwork and try to sue the show for misrepresenting whatever they do. Pretty much every show now has their own because social media has become so involved in everything, if they're not actually going to license the name of, Facebook or Twitter or whatever, every show has their own different like Facebook or Twitter, whatever analog, so that they don't have to deal with, the logistics of trying to make sure that Facebook is happy with how they're being represented or, whatever. This is much more intense on network shows. It's easier for cable shows, especially pay cable, to get to use actual names of businesses and things like that. You'll see on lots of network shows, you'll have the very recognizable Apple MacBook that will have a sticker over the Apple logo. You see a lot less of that on cable shows. Just because it's a smaller audience, they are just more likely to be happy with making a licensing agreement. This will include references to other media also. It's usually pretty easy to just be able to say something about, you hear all the time, I guess The Big Bang Theory is probably the biggest example of this, that are just constantly referencing pop culture. But for certain logos, you have to get that cleared. For certain ways that other media might be referred to, that has to be cleared. You can't say derogatory things about, in certain contexts, about other stories, movies, TV shows, what have you. And that comes down to, how the lawyers are going to approve that. References to actual people. My episode of Hawaii Five-0 was the biggest legal clearances nightmare that the show ever had. My episode dealt with the Kennedy assassination and a conspiracy theory that the team was chasing down, led by Jorge Garcia's character, because he's a conspiracy theorist. And he was theorizing that Kennedy assassination was put together by members of his own cabinet. So we had to walk a very, very difficult tightrope to like what we could say, what we couldn't say, because these, none of them are still alive, but they have families who could come and sue. And, there is a social responsibility too, you could argue, that they not be misrepresented. So that'll be with any, historical figure in any context or any real person, any public figure. But in my case, because we were, making an accusation that was going to be debunked by the end of the episode, we still had to be very, very, very careful. References to government entities, same thing. Hawaii Five-0 was a good example of that. The way that we have characters who used to work for the military, the way they're represented is important. The show would have members of the federal law enforcement come and be a part of the episode, and oftentimes butting heads with the team, so we had to be careful about how they were represented. And again, that's all stuff that goes through the legal department at CBS, and who will employ other contractors to do the research that will make sure that everything is above board, or they're the ones that are in contact with whoever licensing agreements need to be made with. Arbitration. So not often, but every once in a while, an episode will go to arbitration if there's a disagreement over credits on the teleplay and or story. For every episode, there is a teleplay credit and a story credit, and unless they are different, they won't be credited separately. It'll just say written by whoever. But you'll see sometimes story by, one or two people, teleplay by one or two people. And there are different reasons why that might be. It could be that one person started writing an episode and then it was handed off to somebody else for scheduling reasons. It could be that somebody, a freelancer started writing an episode and then it was decided that they weren't going to finish it, so a staff member might finish it. But the case could be that one person decides that they are not getting the credit that they deserve. So what happens in that case is that every draft of every piece of the story, starting with the story document, every draft, the story document, the outline, and then every draft of the script with whatever credited writers' names are on the front of it, that all gets sent to the WGA. Somebody goes through all of that, and they make a ruling about who is going to receive what credits. This also happens if a freelancer is collaborating with a member of the staff. And this is an automatic process that doesn't have anything to do with whether anybody has a disagreement or not. It's just the WGA's way of trying to protect freelancers from, having their work marginalized. When the first year that I was at Hawaii Five-0, there was another assistant on the show who wrote an episode and shared a story credit with people who were on staff. Since that assistant was not on the staff, it was immediately triggered a WGA arbitration. There was no actual disagreement between anyone. It's just how that is done. Okay, so the lawyers are all happy. The credits are all decided, and the studio and network has signed off on everything. There's now a production draft of the script, and so it's going to production. And production is, as you'd imagine, the people who are actually producing the show. Those are, all the stuff. Think of it like pre-production on a film. You've got all the things you'd expect: wardrobe, props, casting, stunts, locations, etc. More and more writers' offices, most of which are in Los Angeles, are not where the show is actually being produced. There's a lot of production in Atlanta, a lot of shows being shot in Atlanta right now. There's a little bit in Texas, around the Austin area, a lot in Vancouver, but a lot of shows are still shot in Los Angeles. Not to break your hearts, if you thought It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia was shot in Philly, it's not. Silicon Valley, also shot in Los Angeles. But still a lot of stuff that is in Vancouver. Hawaii Five-0 and Lost were both shot in Hawaii. So either wherever the show is being produced, if it's in the same place as the writers' offices or not, we need to get everybody on board on the same page. So there'll be a production meeting, and that is when the head of every department, including either the showrunners or someone that they assign that responsibility to, and the writers of the episode will either sit in the same room or they will be video chatting and just kind of go through the whole script and say, here's what we want to focus on for, each of these different aspects for this episode, for this scene, for this character, and everybody weighs in. As the writer or the showrunner is describing, okay, in this scene, we have this character who's doing this. We want him to have this look to him. We want, so we're going to have these props or this prop. And then somebody might pop in and say, well, we could do that, but it'll save a lot of money if we do something else instead. If we cut out this stunt, we won't have to hire a stunt coordinator for another day. Or if we move this location to a set instead of having to go and find a location, it'll save a lot of money or time, because episodes of TV are shot generally in 6 to 8 days. So there'll be often a minimum number of scenes that have to take place on the show's sets, which will be in a soundstage somewhere. And coming out of the production meeting, there will be production revisions, which are just addressing all the issues that come up during the production meeting to make sure that the show making the episode is going to be manageable. After that, and also the director, of course, will be in on the production meeting. At the beginning of the season, and as the season goes on, but most of the episodes have already been assigned to various directors. TV directors, they do about 4 episodes a year, the freelance ones, And, you can't count on them being a regular watcher of the show and someone who knows what is, going on in, continuity and, knowing the characters well enough to be able to do their job. So they'll be a part of the production, they'll read the script, they'll be a part of the production meetings, and they'll miss what's called the tone call, either tone call or the tone meeting, if the director is in the same place as the writer. So the tone call or tone meeting is between the writer and the director, or the showrunner and the director, or some assigned high-level writer and the director. And that's going page by page, scene by scene again, and making sure that the director understands what is, what's going on with this character. Why is this scene important? How should this scene be played? Saying that, this scene should be from this character's POV because of how a series-long arc is being played out. There are also, on most shows, a producing director. And that is someone who is involved in the production of the show, generally an executive producer, who has been a TV director who worked up to have this position. And on Lost, it was Jack Bender. On Breaking Bad, it was Michelle McLaren. She now has the same job on The Deuce, or did, it just ended. And in addition to directing a few episodes of the season, maybe 20% of the episodes of the season, and usually also the first and last, the finale, the premiere and finale of the season, they are responsible for working with each director of each episode to make sure that the look and style of the show remains consistent throughout. The tone call or tone meeting will often also involve the producing director. So as I was talking earlier about the ranks of the writers, are often, most of them are as producers, starting from co-producer, producer, supervising producer, all the way up to co-executive producer and executive producer. Traditionally, and not just, this is because, as I said before, they are contributing to, everybody's contributing to shaping the story of the episode, but this is also because they have other responsibilities in helping the show on a production level. There'll be, a high-level writer who will, be responsible for dealing with casting, or talking to the casting director and making sure that, we'll say, all right, we want this actor for this episode, Eddie, go and pin them, which is what it's called when you, tell them that, like, we want you for this episode, don't go down to anything else during that time without talking to us first. They'll also be responsible for doing revisions or taking a look at scripts or outlines before they get to the showrunner, and giving feedback to make the showrunner's life a little bit easier. For pre-production decisions, same thing. When it comes to saying the things were discussed in the production meeting, a lot of times that, higher level writers will have a hand in saying, like, no, let's move this scene. This is starting to feel a little expensive. I think we can do this cheaper if we move this scene onto a set. If we cut out this, this action sequence, whatever it's going to be. Traditionally, writers would also go to set. We're seeing this less and less now because of the distance between where production is and where the writing offices are. Some shows will still send writers to set, but it's more it obviously takes money out of the budget to fly people, put them up at a hotel and all that. So that's why the tone calls and production meetings that I mentioned before have become so much more important. But the writer on set will be doing some of the work that the producing director would do, which is kind of making sure that the kind of safeguarding the kind of tonal consistency of the show, or making sure that, you know, whatever director they're working with there, or whatever like guest actors that might be on the episode are making sure they aren't kind of breaking the mold of the show too much, and that it's still, you know, that every episode of Hawaii Five-0 feels like an episode of Hawaii Five-0. Yeah, so production decisions, character motivation, that's something that writers on set will handle. Usually whatever writer of the episode that is being filmed will be the one to go to set. There are occasionally, there'll be a writer that just spends most of their time on set, and is the one responsible for communicating with the writers' offices if there are any concerns, any budget issues, and again, making sure that the style of the show remains consistent. Production. This is just, you know, shooting the show. It'll take usually 6 to 8 days, depending on the show. And it's usually shot all in one location. Game of Thrones is a recent and notable exception to that, which is being shot in, you know, 2 to 3 different countries at once at any given moment. That is very, very unusual. Occasionally there will be, you know, a splinter unit, they'll call it, which is a smaller production unit that will go out and get, you know, B-roll or inserts, whatever, of in either the same location or a different location. You know, since I said, you know, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is shot here. You know, Dexter, which took place in Miami, is shot here. These shows all had to go to the locations, the cities in which they're supposed to take place, and get inserts to you know, make it look like it's actually being shot wherever it's being shot. So every production crew has 2 different crews of assistant directors, directors of photography, and unit production managers. And they will alternate episodes. There'll be the assistant director, the DP, and the UPM who works on the odd episodes, and the same group who will work on the even episodes. And that is because one episode will be prepping while another one shoots. And again, the producing director is responsible for making sure that the continuity of style for the show. Post-production. So the episode has been shot. All the footage is in the post office. The post office will be in the same place as the writer's office. And that is because the showrunner, in addition to running the writer's room, is also overseeing the edit. So the editorial process is similar to the script writing process, in that there are lots of rounds of revisions that have to go through the different entities in the office and in the studio and network. So the first part of the thing that we're going to get there is the editor's assembly cut. And that is just the editor taking all the footage that was shot and putting together and assembling. And they'll have some help there from notes that were taken on set, where, you know, the director will say, like, this is the best take there. As the episode is being shot, dailies are sent to the writer's office, so that the writers, there's another aspect of writers as producers. Dailies are sent to the writer's office, where the showrunner or another high-level writer or everyone will watch. At Once Upon a Time, at lunch, everybody watched dailies. A lot of shows do that, not all of them do. At the very least, a high-level writer assigned to it and or the writer whose episode is being shot will watch the dailies and weigh in. Excuse me. Because there'll be times that, you know, they'll see, like I said before, you know, you always have to worry when you have a director who maybe you haven't worked with before or doesn't have a lot of experience, or if they're directing the show for the first time, you really have to take a look at the dailies, make sure they're getting everything right, because They could be, an actor's performance could be off, or they're not shooting enough coverage, something like that. So watching dailies is important to that. And that's another way that certain scenes, or excuse me, certain takes will be flagged for the editor specifically to put into the assembly. So editor puts his or her assembly together. The director will come and weigh in and spend some time working with the editor to create the director's cut. And that is the first cut that the writer's office will see, starting with the showrunners and then, the rest of the staff, and especially the writer whose episode it was shot. Sometimes there will be a writer's cut, and that'll be another aspect of writers working as producers. It's varied from the different shows that I have been on, how much showrunners like to let their writers produce their own episodes. Again, like with sending writers to set or not, that's a decision that the showrunner will make. So sometimes when the director's cut comes in, the writer of the episode or writers will spend some time with the editor and get the episode to where he or she thinks it's kind of at its best. After that, the showrunner will go in and work with the editor and get it to where he or she thinks that the episode is at its best, and then that will go to the studio and network, and that is called like the studio network draft of the script. That's the studio and network cut. Again, on a first-year show, this might go to the studio and the network separately. Most often, though, it'll be one cut that everybody will weigh in on and give notes on. Oftentimes, it's not just seeing what the studio and network like or don't like about the show, but the showrunner will get the show to a place where it's still too long. Episodes of network TV or cable with commercials will have to be between 42 and 43 minutes, and it has to be precise down to the second how long the episode is going to be. This will include any recap that comes at the beginning of serialized shows almost always have a recap. We all remember Carlton Cuse's voice previously on Lost. And a lot of procedurals will have this also to kind of recap some of the serialized or character-based elements of the show that are going to be referenced in that particular episode. So recaps are included in the runtime of the show between 42 and 43 minutes. So the showrunner might send the episode to the studio network, and it might be a minute or two too long, and they want to know what the studio network thinks should be cut. Studio network might also, disagree about, say, wasn't there this in the script, and then you cut it out. Actually, we think, the audience will have an easier time following if you put that back in. Or say, we really want to see more of this actor because, we have them on another show, and it's going to be a good showcase for them to appear more here. After that round of notes, we have the locked cut, which is what it sounds like. The show is cut for cut, minute for minute, second for second, what it is going to look like when it airs. That is in the editorial sense, because of course there is the rest of post. ADR, which stands for additional dialogue recording. That is when the actors will come in and they will record in a sound booth, either lines where the production audio didn't quite work, or lines that have been changed for continuity or for clarity reasons that are different from how they were recorded on set. The score, of course, every show has a composer who's doing the score. Visual effects, more and more we're using computers to complete effects, or in the case of Once Upon a Time, there was the digital backlot approach where everything in the flashbacks and fairy tale land, everything was shot on a green screen soundstage. and all of the backgrounds were built digitally and then dropped in post. Color timing. Color timing and color correction are the process of when you shoot raw footage on a camera, it just doesn't look right. The way the camera processes information to get as much information as visual information as possible needs to be tweaked with and have some adjustments made. One, so that shot for shot, everything looks the same lighting wise. And two, there'll be stylistic elements where, you know, you just want to change the color a little bit or change the contrast of a shot or, you know, kind of bring the color up or down. That's color timing and color correction. Promotion. Increasingly, writers are getting involved in promoting the show. This is once the episode is, well, generally once the episode is done, or while it's in post, writers might contribute to marketing the show. That could be working on a catch-up special. So most network shows, they'll have a winter hiatus. So half of the season, or about half of the season, will run from September to December, and then the second half will pick up again in January or February. At the beginning on a serialized show, Lost would always do this, Once Upon a Time always did this, and Game of Thrones did this too. There will be a half-hour or hour-long special that is basically a clip show, and oftentimes will have a narrator kind of just reminding you of everything that happened. And writers could be involved in putting this together. At any rate, the showrunners will be the ones who have the final say in that and, you know, oversee producing that. The channel guide blurbs. So, you know, when you're scrolling through DirecTV and you see that, you know, an episode of Chicago PD is coming up, and you have the little blurb that says what happens in the episode. Usually that is written by a copywriter who works for the network or the production company. But sometimes they'll get the writers involved in that too. And that always gets bounced off the showrunners to make sure that that the blurb isn't giving away anything important, make sure there's no spoiler alerts. Taglines for TV spots and for posters, same thing. Usually there are copywriters who cover this. Sometimes writers are asked to contribute or, come up with ideas or to help kind of shape ideas that, copywriters have. The showrunner will come in and say, they got this tagline. We feel like it'd be a little better, guys. Spend half an hour and see if you can top it. Social media, that's, more and more important. There's pretty much every writer of every show is expected to be contributing to promoting the show on social media. They're tweeting about it. They're tweeting pictures of the script cover whenever, to announce the title of the episode. Hey, everybody, my episode is airing tonight. Come, watch tonight at 8. At Hawaii Five-0, there were live tweets where the writers would all get together and watch the episode every Friday night in the office, and everybody was tweeting out just kind of a running commentary on the show as it was going on. And then, episode airs. Congratulations, you've written an episode of television. It's gotten, gotten through legal. It's, gotten through post. And tell your mom to watch. Hope that nothing terrible happens so that the news reporters butt in to tell the world about it. And then wait for those green envelopes. Residuals are a wonderful thing. After you write an episode of TV or movies, WGA makes sure that you continue to collect residuals for them, which means you are sharing the profits of, the episode going into syndication or being sold for streaming rights, things like that. And it's always a nice surprise to get an envelope in the mail with some amount of money in it. A friend of mine joked that the green envelopes, as they're known because they come in green envelopes, are the Schrodinger's box of the mail, because before you open it, it's simultaneously worth $5,000 and 12 cents, because you never know how much it's going to be. So, question on naming in fiction. Can you name a character like Ms. Smith, Mr. Jones, no first name? Yes, you can. Good question. That is a good way around that, around having to get something cleared. If it is a particularly popular name, or it seems to be a specific reference to someone, like if you said Mr. Spielberg, you probably would not get it passed because there's kind of one famous Spielberg and you don't want to piss him off. On public domain history, can use real name without a problem, assuming you follow public domain law. Public domain history. Can you use the real name of the? Oh, I see. Yes, generally, if you're, I believe you're talking about a character that is in a public domain story. Generally, yes, you can do that. There's one case I can think of where this gets a little tricky, and the movie White Zombie that starred Bela Lugosi back in the 30s. And this is a very specific example, and I don't know of any other examples, but there could be some. There were concerns that certain elements of the movie White Zombie, while the movie itself is now in public domain, there were concerns that elements of it were stolen from a book. So even though White Zombie is public domain, to not piss off the people who still have the rights to the book, people are kind of staying away from like any remakes of that or references to it. So again, very specific example, but for the most part, yes, public domain stuff is pretty easy to use. For foreign names, without going through the rule that referred to under names, no more than 3 people in the US. It's about a person living in the US. That is, so if there is obviously there'll be 100 Bob Smiths in the US, so you're gonna have no problem there. If there's a foreign name of somebody who lives in, Zanzibar, you can probably, I'm not positive about this, but you can probably safely use their name as long as they're not living in the US because you're writing characters who live in the US. So I'm asking my thoughts about those over 40 years and above, especially white males. Does TV writing make any sense anymore? It sounds like you're asking if it makes sense to pursue a writing career if you are already 40 years old. And I would say yes. I do know some writers who, especially those who have had other careers before and are bringing a different perspective to the writer's room and the writing world, who want to try their hand at writing. You're going to have to earn your way just like everybody else. You're going to have to start at the bottom. But I know folks who are over 40 who have started out as lower level writers and have worked their way up. One way, you can try the standard ways to get in, which is to go and find yourself an agent or a manager who is going to work to get you staffed on a show. The other way is if you are, people are being staffed because they have clever Twitter accounts, which I have feelings about, I'm not going to get into, but that's another way that you can do that. If you self-publish a book that winds up getting, somebody wants to option and adapt into a TV show, that's another way in. But yeah, and as far as white males are concerned, there's kind of a backlash against the idea of trying to bring more diversity into the television writing world. I am a white male. I don't feel threatened by this. I know a lot of people do, and I personally believe that's an overreaction. I mean, what it comes down to is that if you have the talent, you will find a place in a writer's room. Also being asked, what's the prime reason that I was able to work on so many different types of genres of shows? what got me picked for them, it was pretty much all people that I knew. My first way into television was being a personal assistant to the great, great writer Elizabeth Sarnoff. She worked on Deadwood and then on Lost, and I was her assistant on season 5 of Lost. And then season 6, there was an opening in the writer's room to be a writer's assistant, and I was incredibly fortunate to get that promotion. So the next show I was on, and then once you get into a writer's room, it is all about making connections and maintaining connections with people. Especially like as an assistant or script coordinator or any kind of support staff. After Lost, I worked on Alcatraz because Liz Sarnoff co-created and ran that show. After Alcatraz, I worked on Once Upon a Time, and that was because that show was created by Edward Kitsis and Adam Horowitz, who I knew from Lost. So when they needed a writer's assistant, they gave me a call. And then I wound up on Hawaii Five-0 because Stephen Lillian and Brian Winbrandt, who were the other co-creators of Alcatraz, they wound up on Hawaii Five-0, and when they needed a writer's assistant, they gave me a call. So, you know, I definitely prefer working on genre shows, on, you know, horror, sci-fi, fantasy, stuff like that. It's just kind of where my heart is creatively. But like anybody in TV, you take the work that comes to you, unless you are, you know, really, really up there and can really pick and choose what you want to do. Another question about notes. If the studio and network have notes that clash with each other, does one override the other? Yes. So the process will, if there are separate rounds of notes, starts with like the production company, like, you know, Bad Robot in the case of Alcatraz, then the studio, and then the network. The network has final say because they are the ones who are responsible for, you know, for acquiring and maintaining advertisers. And they're the ones who, you know, at the end of the day, the show is on their network. So yeah, network will have like the greatest say in that, and they'll, you know, they'll be reasonable and talk to each other and try to, you know, work out any differences they have. But you do, in the case of first-year shows, you can wind up in awkward situations where the lower levels, the production company or the studio, is trying to anticipate the network's notes, saying, you know, I like this, but I think the network might like it, so let's make this change, which, you know, I'll leave it to you to have an opinion on whether or not that's a good way to make television. Okay, so for a story inspired by real people who aren't famous, just regular people, what would be the rules of using their names without their written clearance? Would changing their names slightly make a difference, or do you need to change them entirely? It depends, and that's something that you just kind of have to ask the lawyers about oftentimes, like what their comfort level is. I mean, a lot of times you can just kind of sneak in a name of somebody that you know and hope that it clears if, you know that person is going to be comfortable with it. Either way, the less than one, more than three rule will apply. So even if you have a friend and you want to use, you know, her name, Jane Smith, and obviously Jane Smith is not a good example there because there will be a million of those, but the lawyers say, sorry, Jane Smith doesn't clear, but you can say, oh, well, I have my friend and it's a reference to her, and then she'll sign off on it. Doesn't matter. You still don't get to use it. What are the pay ranges for various writer positions? If you're a new voice in writing, there are minimums for each level of writers, from staff writer up to executive producer. You will get paid at least that, and your WGA, your guild dues, will be based on that minimum. If you have less experience, you're probably only going to be getting the minimum. But if you have a baller agent or manager who is going to bat for you, or if you're high in demand, you can get paid. Most people are paid above the minimum I don't know exactly what they are, but you can actually go on the WGA website and find that out. Do I work with writing consultants to improve my writing, even though I'm already experienced? Do I recommend working with those consultants? Yes and yes. I don't go to too many consultants myself because I work with I have a network of friends who are writers and are very talented. I also have writers who I have worked for in the past who are generous enough to read my work, and they'll give me notes. So I myself, because I'm lucky enough to have those resources, I have not hired consultants in the past, but in general, like, I believe that hiring consultants is a very good resource. It's something that I do, so I suppose I'm a little bit biased in that regard. But yeah, if you think, it's definitely an opportunity to make your work better, and I advise you to take that step if writing is something that you want to do and you don't have other people around you who you believe will be giving you the feedback you need to make your writing the best it can be. Oh, somebody asked if I'll be doing any more Roadmap Writers programs. Maybe. We'll see. I enjoyed doing this. I enjoyed your questions. And yeah, hopefully I will be back in the future. I also do script consults for them, so feel free to send any of that my way.